An alien queen was about to die until a human acted. The galaxy was vast, and among its stars, few species were as feared as the Zorath. For centuries, they had conquered world after world, crushing all opposition under their ironclad rule. Their empire was like a tidal wave, sweeping through the cosmos with relentless might. The Zorath were a race of warriors, their bodies engineered for battle, their minds sharpened for destruction. But above all, there was one figure who embodied their power, the Zorath queen, Jara. Jara was the ruler of the Zorath Empire, an alien queen who had never known defeat. Her presence was a symbol of dominance, and her word was law. Under her command, the Zorath had crushed countless civilizations, leaving nothing but ashes and ruin in their wake. No one dared challenge her authority. She was the embodiment of their strength, the one who had led them to the top of the galaxy's food chain. But as mighty as she was, even Jara was not invincible. It was during a pivotal battle against a mysterious enemy that Jara found herself in peril. The conflict had started as a simple skirmish, a small, unimportant planet that the Zorath had set their sights on. But soon it became clear that this enemy was not like the others. The planet's defenders, though seemingly weak, possessed technology and tactics that baffled the Zorath. What started as a straightforward conquest quickly turned into a fight for survival. The Zorath fleet, led by Jara, had been caught off guard by the enemy's advanced weapons. Blinding beams of energy sliced through their ships, tearing apart their armadas with ruthless precision. The Zorath forces, unaccustomed to being attacked so fiercely, were thrown into chaos. Jara, ever the strategist, tried to rally her troops, but it was clear that this was no ordinary foe. The battle raged for hours, with the Zorath losing ground by the minute. Jara, commanding her forces from the heart of the flagship, fought desperately to maintain control. But even her legendary tactics could not save them. The enemy's weapons were too powerful, and their numbers too vast. One by one, Jara's ships were destroyed, their hulking forms falling to the void of space. As the battle neared its climax, Jara made a fateful decision. She ordered a full retreat, but it was too late. A final, devastating blast struck her flagship, crippling it beyond repair. The Queen's personal warship, the Zorath pride of their fleet, was torn apart in a brilliant explosion. Jara was thrown from her command throne, her body thrown violently against the walls of the ship. When she awoke, she found herself stranded on an unfamiliar planet. The ship had been destroyed, and her army was nowhere to be found. The vast stretch of space had been replaced by a barren, desolate landscape. The sky above her was an unfamiliar shade of orange, casting an eerie glow over the dying world. Jara's wounds were severe. She could feel the deep gashes on her body, the broken bones, the bruising that covered her skin. Her energy reserves were low, and she knew that without immediate help, she would not survive much longer. For the first time in her life, Jara was helpless. Her once unshakable strength had faded, and she was left at the mercy of an alien planet that seemed to care nothing for her existence. The Queen lay in the dust, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She could hear the distant rumble of the planet's dying atmosphere, the winds whipping across the barren plains. A harsh, alien wind stung her wounds, but she didn't have the strength to care. But as the darkness closed in on her, Jara's mind began to race. She was the Zorath Queen. She could not die like this, abandoned, defeated on some insignificant world. She had been the might of her empire, the terror of the stars. Her people had worshipped her. They had feared her. She had never known a moment of weakness. Now she lay on the ground, vulnerable, helpless. Jara's thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound in the distance. Her vision was blurry, but she could make out the silhouette of a figure approaching. At first, she assumed it was a figment of her imagination, some trick of the mind in her weakened state. But the figure drew closer, and as it came into focus, Jara saw the unmistakable form of a human. The human approached cautiously, a weapon slung across their back, but there was no sign of aggression in their movements. The human's face was hard to read, but there was something about the way they moved that intrigued Jara. The human knelt beside her, taking in her broken form. For a moment, Jara's pride flared up. She wanted to lash out to demand that this human leave her alone, but she couldn't. Her body was too weak, her mind too exhausted. "Stay still," the human said, their voice surprisingly gentle. Jara's eyes narrowed in suspicion. She had been taught that humans were weak, insignificant creatures, just another race to be conquered. And yet here they were, showing her an act of kindness when she least expected it. She could feel their hand on her side, applying pressure to her wounds in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. There was no fear in their eyes, no hatred, just concern. "Why?" Jara managed to croak, her voice hoarse. The human looked down at her, their face softening. "Because you're not just a monster, are you? You're a person, you deserve a chance." Jara blinked, confusion flooding her mind. This human, this weak, insignificant creature was showing her mercy. Was it a trap? Had they come to finish her off, to claim her life for their own gain? But the human didn't move to kill her. Instead, they reached into a pack, pulling out a small device. Jara watched, unable to move, as the human used the device to stabilize her injuries. The pain didn't disappear completely, but it dulled enough to allow her to regain some semblance of strength. The human sat back, studying her carefully. "I don't know if you're going to live, but I'm not just going to leave you here to die. Not like this." Jara's mind was a storm of emotions. She was no longer in control, no longer the supreme ruler of the Zorath Empire. She was broken, on the brink of death, and now a human, of all species, was showing her mercy. Was this an act of weakness or something else? Was it a test? But as the minutes passed, with the human watching over her, Jara began to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. A flicker of hope. Maybe there was more to this human than she had ever given them credit for. Maybe they had something the Zorath had lost along the way, something more powerful than strength or dominance, something that could save her. As the night sky darkened overhead, Jara closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of the human's presence beside her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't alone in the vast, cold universe. And for the first time, she felt something more than fear. Perhaps, just perhaps, the human had saved her life. And in return, she would save them. The first rays of the sun broke through the thick clouds, casting an eerie light on the barren planet's surface. Jara slowly opened her eyes, the pain still lingering in her body but not as sharp as it had been before. The human's actions had brought her some relief, though she wasn't sure how long it would last. She felt weak, but the deep sense of helplessness she had felt before had begun to fade. The human had saved her life, and for that, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of gratitude. But as she lay there, trying to gather her thoughts, Jara couldn't push aside the wariness that had settled in her chest. This human, this fragile creature by her side, had done something no one in her life ever had. They had shown her mercy. Jara had never understood mercy. It was a concept foreign to her, something her species had never embraced. The Zorath were conquerors, warriors who ruled through fear and strength. The thought of helping an enemy was absurd to them. Yet here she was, in the presence of a human who had done just that. She glanced at the human. They were sitting a short distance away, their eyes scanning the horizon, ever watchful. Their name was Cassandra Holt, or Cass, as she had introduced herself. The human soldier was a mere speck compared to the grand empire Jara had once commanded. Yet for reasons Jara could not quite understand, Cass seemed almost noble. Cass had been silent for most of the day, but she had been kind. She had checked on Jara's wounds several times, offering her water and food when she could. The human had even shared some of their own ration supplies, despite knowing the queen could easily turn on them if she regained her strength. "Why are you doing this?" Jara had asked earlier when Cass offered her more food. It wasn't a question of hunger, but a question of motive. The Zorath had destroyed entire planets. They had left nothing but suffering in their wake. So why would this human, someone from a species so small and weak in Jara's eyes, offer such kindness to her? Cass had simply shrugged. "Because no one deserves to die alone, no matter who they are." The words struck Jara like a blow. She didn't understand them, but they lingered in her mind, swirling with confusion. How could a human care so much? Jara had spent her life conquering, seeing the universe as a battleground where only the strong survived. Yet here she was, depending on the very creatures she had once thought beneath her. Her mind was a battlefield now, torn between old pride and the strange feelings that this human had stirred within her. She wanted to reject the idea that mercy could have any value. She had been taught that survival was for the strong, and those who showed weakness were doomed to fall. But Cass had proven that survival wasn't always about brute strength. Sometimes it was about compassion. Jara wasn't sure if she could accept that truth. It felt like a betrayal to everything she had believed in. As the day wore on, the pain in her body lessened, but her mind remained restless. Cass had gone silent, staring off into the distance. Jara could see the worry in her eyes, though she made no move to speak about it. She was waiting for something, perhaps for Jara to speak first. The silence between them grew heavy, each moment stretching longer than the last. "You don't have to stay," Jara finally said, her voice hoarse. "You've done enough." Cass turned her head slightly, her gaze soft but firm. "I'm not leaving you," she said simply. "You've been through enough already. We need to find a way off this planet." Jara could feel her temper rising. The human had no idea who she was. The queen of the Zorath Empire, brought low by a simple human. The thought burned like acid in her chest. But as much as she wanted to lash out, to tell Cass to leave her to die as she deserved, a strange feeling held her back. The words were there on the tip of her tongue, but she could not speak them. Instead, she said, "I don't need you to save me." Cass didn't react, as if she had expected the harsh words. She didn't challenge them or try to convince Jara otherwise. She simply stood up and began to gather their things, preparing for the journey ahead. It was a small, quiet act, but it held an undeniable strength. Jara's heart skipped a beat, but she refused to acknowledge the growing unease within her. This human with their quiet determination was unlike anyone Jara had ever encountered. The queen's mind drifted back to her empire, how far it had fallen. She remembered the Zorath fleet, the mighty armada she had commanded. But now all that was left of her empire was a handful of scattered survivors, stranded on distant worlds, cut off from the power they once held. Jara had been the figurehead of that power, but she was nothing now. Just another fallen monarch, abandoned on a dying world. She couldn't shake the nagging thought that her downfall was not just a result of the enemy's strength, but her own mistakes. She had been so focused on expanding her empire, on crushing every race beneath her boot, that she had forgotten the value of the very things Cass had shown her: mercy, kindness, compassion. And now, as she lay in the dirt waiting for death, it was the human who offered her these things. The irony was too much for Jara to bear. The mighty Zorath queen, reduced to depending on a human for survival. It stung, but the sting was different this time. It wasn't from pride. It was from a deep, painful realization that perhaps the way of the Zorath had been wrong all along. Cass moved about, preparing to leave the shelter they had made in the ruins. She turned to Jara, her face serious but not unkind. "We need to move," she said. "The enemy could still be tracking us." Jara's pride flared again. The thought of running from the enemy, hiding like a prey animal, was unthinkable to her. But the truth was clear: she was not strong enough to fight back. She could not do this alone, and the only reason she was alive right now was because of Cass's mercy. "I'll go," Jara said, her voice quiet but steady. "Lead the way." Cass nodded, her eyes meeting the queen's. There was no judgment in her gaze, only determination. The human had made up her mind, and now Jara, despite her pride, found herself following along. There was something in Cass's presence that made Jara feel less alone in the vast emptiness of the planet. They began to walk, slowly at first, as Jara's body was still too weak to move quickly. But as the hours passed, her strength began to return. She could feel the shift within her, both physical and mental. The pain in her body subsided and her thoughts became clearer. But one thing remained constant: her growing respect for this human. As they moved through the barren landscape, Jara realized that she had been wrong about humans. They were not weak, as she had once believed. They were resilient. And if there was one thing Jara could respect, it was resilience. Though she had once been the mighty queen of the Zorath, standing alone at the top of the galaxy, she now found herself walking beside a human soldier, an unlikely companion in a world where survival was no longer guaranteed by strength alone. But there was something else, something deeper that Jara couldn't put into words. As they walked side by side, she couldn't help but feel that, in some strange way, her journey had only just begun. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and quiet determination. Jara's body, once so powerful and impervious to pain, now felt fragile. The harsh conditions of the planet, its dry, cracked soil and the relentless winds that tore at them, only made everything harder. Every step felt heavier than the last. Yet, despite the discomfort, Jara couldn't deny the strange sense of camaraderie that had begun to grow between her and Cass. It was an unspoken bond, forged in the most unlikely of places. As they traveled across the desolate landscape, Jara noticed that Cass seemed unfazed by the difficulties they faced. The human soldier had a quiet resilience, a strength that wasn't physical but mental. It was something Jara couldn't quite understand, but it fascinated her. Cass had endured hardships of her own, of that much Jara was certain, yet she never let it show. The humans' resolve was unwavering, and it made Jara question everything she had ever known about humans. They were more than the weak, insignificant creatures she had once believed them to be. The journey took them through barren stretches of land that seemed endless. Every few hours, they would stop to rest, but their progress was slow. Jara's body wasn't healing as quickly as she had hoped, and she knew that time was running out. They needed to find shelter or they would both die in the wasteland. Cass was the only reason she still had hope. The human didn't show any signs of slowing down. She was the one leading the way, pushing forward with a determination that Jara admired, even if she was too proud to admit it. At night, when the cold winds would howl through the empty plains, they would huddle together for warmth. Jara found it strange at first to share such a vulnerable moment with someone she had once considered an enemy. But over time, the awkwardness faded, and Jara began to appreciate the human's presence. Cass was calm, her voice a steady anchor in the silence. She would tell stories of her home on Earth, of cities and forests, of people who lived their lives in peace. Jara listened, fascinated by the stories. Her own life had been so different, filled with constant battles and a singular focus on power. She had never thought to look at the world the way Cass did. One evening, as they sat by a small fire they had managed to start, Jara spoke. "Tell me more about Earth," she said quietly, her voice betraying a hint of curiosity. Cass smiled softly, the warmth of the fire reflecting in her eyes. "Well, Earth is a beautiful place," she began, her voice carrying a hint of nostalgia. "There are forests, oceans, mountains, everything. People live in cities, but there's also a lot of nature. We've learned to live alongside it, to respect it." Jara listened intently, her mind racing. She had never known a world like that, a world where people and nature coexisted peacefully. In her own empire, everything had been about conquest, about taking and destroying. She had never once considered the idea of balance or respect. She had never thought to look at the universe in the way Cass did. "There are also a lot of struggles," Cass continued, her tone shifting slightly. "Humans have fought wars too. We've made mistakes, hurt each other. But we've learned over time to grow and adapt. We faced our darkness and come out stronger." Jara felt a flicker of understanding. "You believe in redemption?" Cass nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Yes, I do. I think everyone deserves a chance. Even those who have done terrible things. We can change if we're willing to." Jara was quiet for a moment, her thoughts swirling. She had never believed in redemption. Her people were conquerors, and they had no room for weakness or mercy. They had taken what they wanted, destroyed what stood in their way, and moved on. There had been no time for reflection, no time for redemption, but Cass's words struck a chord deep within her. Maybe, just maybe, there was a different way to live. Maybe, she thought, there was more to existence than power and control. The next day, they continued their journey. The landscape began to change, slowly but surely. The once barren desert terrain was replaced by rocky hills and sparse vegetation. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that they were getting closer to something, anything, that could offer them shelter. By the time nightfall arrived, they had reached the base of a jagged mountain range. The air was colder here, and the wind howled through the narrow passes between the rocks. It wasn't a perfect place to rest, but it was better than the open plains. Cass set up a small campfire, and they sat around it, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Jara's body still ached, and the memories of her empire haunted her. She had once been the ruler of the Zorath, a race of warriors who had brought entire worlds to their knees. She had stood at the top of the galaxy, surrounded by power and fear. But now she was nothing more than a broken queen, stranded on a planet far from home. Her empire was shattered, her people scattered, and she was left with nothing but the cold winds of this desolate world. And yet there was a small flicker of something else inside her, a feeling that had been absent for so long. It was the feeling of hope, of a future that wasn't defined by conquest. For the first time in her life, Jara wasn't thinking about power. She wasn't thinking about war or empire. She was thinking about survival, about finding a way to move forward, no matter what it took. Cass noticed the change in Jara's demeanor and smiled softly. She didn't need to say anything. She knew that, in her own way, Jara was starting to see the world differently. Maybe, just maybe, they would both survive this. But it wouldn't be because of strength alone. It would be because of something more. The days passed, and as the two of them continued their journey, the bond between them deepened. Jara found herself trusting Cass in ways she never thought possible. The human soldier had shown her a different side of the universe, a side that wasn't just about domination and strength. It was about survival, about compassion, and about the strength that came from working together. And as they approached the base of the mountain, Jara realized that this journey, this strange alliance, had already changed her. No longer was she the queen of the Zorath, a figurehead of power and fear. She was just a survivor like Cass, fighting for another day. The mountain range loomed ahead, dark and imposing against the setting sun. But Jara no longer saw it as an obstacle. She saw it as a symbol of the journey ahead, one that she would take with Cass, no longer as a queen and a soldier, but as two people bound together by something more powerful than any empire: hope. The mountain range that loomed before them was nothing like Jara had ever seen. Before, she had spent her life in the vast emptiness of space, gazing at stars from the comfort of her ship. She had never once thought to explore a planet, let alone trek across its harsh terrain. Now here she was, climbing through jagged rocks, her strength still recovering from the battle and the injuries she had sustained. Her body ached with each step, but she kept moving because that's what Cass was doing. The human had no hesitation, no sign of exhaustion. She simply moved forward with the same quiet determination that had carried them this far. The landscape was harsh, with narrow paths and sharp cliffs. The wind howled through the cracks in the rocks, biting at their exposed skin. Jara's senses were alert, her warrior instincts kicking in, even though her body was still weak. Cass, however, moved with ease. It was as though she had grown used to such conditions. Jara couldn't help but marvel at the human's resilience. She had never seen anyone who could endure such hardships without complaint. Cass's presence was comforting, but also humbling. Jara, once the ruler of an empire that spanned galaxies, was now dependent on a human for survival. The hours stretched on, and the two of them climbed higher into the mountains. The wind picked up, growing colder with each passing moment. The temperature dropped, and Jara could feel the chill seeping into her bones. Her body was beginning to falter again, but Cass noticed and without a word slowed her pace. "You need to rest," Cass said quietly, turning back to face Jara. "We're not far from the top." Jara, who had been pushing herself to keep up, nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was out of pride or genuine need. The queen had never been one to rest, never one to admit weakness. But now she realized how foolish that had been. She couldn't keep up the same pace as before. Her body was still recovering, and it was clear that even her formidable strength had its limits. Cass helped her to a rocky outcrop where they could sit for a moment. The sky above them was a deep blue, almost black, and the stars were beginning to twinkle. Jara watched as Cass unstrapped her pack, pulling out a small ration and handing it to her. It was a simple meal, a mix of dried food and water, but it was all they had. Jara took it, grateful but not used to such small, humble gestures. She had always been surrounded by luxury, food prepared by the finest chefs, soldiers at her command, planets under her rule. Now she had nothing but the kindness of a human who had no obligation to help her. Cass, noticing Jara's quiet contemplation, spoke softly. "You're wondering why I'm doing this, aren't you?" Jara's eyes met Cass's, and for the first time she felt a strange vulnerability. She had never been one to reveal her thoughts, but somehow this human had a way of making her feel seen in a way she hadn't before. There was no judgment, no fear, just understanding. "I've wondered about that," Jara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saved me. You've been saving me since we met. But why? I'm the enemy. I've destroyed worlds. I've killed countless beings. I've done unspeakable things. Why would you care what happens to me?" Cass took a deep breath and looked at the stars above them. "I think everyone deserves a chance," she said simply. "Everyone, no matter what they've done. People make mistakes. They hurt others, but that doesn't mean they can't change. I don't know what happened to you, Jara. I don't know your past, but I know what I see now. And right now, I see someone who's trying, who's surviving, who hasn't given up." Jara felt something stir inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It was hope, but it was fragile. The idea that she could change, that there was more to life than just domination and power. It was a difficult thing to grasp. But Cass's words made her want to believe. For the first time in years, Jara found herself questioning the very foundation of her existence. "I've never been taught to believe in change," Jara murmured, looking down at the ground. I've only ever been taught to conquer, to rule, to be powerful. Cass nodded, her eyes steady. I understand. I've been taught a lot of things too, about what it means to be strong. But strength isn't just about fighting, it's about surviving. And sometimes surviving means learning from the mistakes you've made and choosing to do better. Jara let the words sink in. Could she really change? Could she, the Zorath queen, abandon everything she had known and start over? The thought was terrifying, but there was a small part of her, something deep inside, that wanted to believe it was possible. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the wind rustling through the rocks and the distant call of a bird of prey soaring high above them. The peace of the moment was unsettling to Jara. She had never known peace. Her life had been one battle after another, one conquest after another. But now she was learning that there could be peace, even in the most unlikely places. As they resumed their journey up the mountain, Jara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a distant rumble. Cass immediately stiffened, her hand going to the weapon at her side. Jara felt the change in the air, the tension that filled the space around them. The rumble grew louder, and it became clear that it was no natural sound. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Get ready, Cass said, her voice tight with urgency. We've got company. Jara's heart raced. The enemy had found them. It was inevitable. She had known it was only a matter of time before they were tracked down. She had been foolish to think they could escape. But now she was not alone. Cass was with her, and somehow that made all the difference. The rumble grew louder, and suddenly a group of figures appeared over the ridge. They were humanoid in shape, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. Jara's instincts kicked in. She was no stranger to enemies, but these figures were different. They didn't move like soldiers. They moved like hunters, their eyes scanning the terrain as if they were looking for something specific. Cass tensed beside her, and Jara could feel her grip tightening on the weapon in her hand. The human wasn't afraid. That much was clear. But the tension in the air was palpable. They were outnumbered. They didn't have the luxury of time. We can't take them on, Cass said quietly, her voice calm despite the danger. We need to run. We can make it to the cave up ahead. It's a dead end, but we can hold out there. Jara nodded, her mind racing. She had always been the one to dictate the terms of battle, to fight on her own terms. But now she had to trust someone else. She had to trust Cass. Together they ran, their footsteps echoing against the rocky ground. The figures behind them gave chase, but they were slow, perhaps because they didn't expect their prey to fight back. Jara could hear their footsteps growing fainter, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not now. They reached the cave just as the first of the figures rounded the corner. Cass led the way inside, her hand guiding Jara through the darkness. The cold of the cave seeped into their bones, but they had no choice. It was their only refuge. As they crouched in the shadows, the sounds of their pursuers grew louder. They were closing in, but Jara wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of resolve. She wasn't alone. She wasn't fighting for power. She was fighting for survival. And that, Jara thought, was something even the greatest of empires could never take away. The cold, damp air inside the cave bit at their skin as Jara and Cass huddled in the shadows, waiting. The sounds of the figures outside had grown quieter, but Jara knew better than to relax. The enemy was still out there, hunting them. They couldn't stay in the cave forever. They needed to act quickly. Cass's eyes scanned the cave's entrance, her expression hard but focused. Her hand gripped the weapon at her side, her posture ready to spring into action at any moment. Jara could see the resolve in the human's eyes. Cass was no longer just a soldier. She was a leader, a protector. And in this moment, Jara felt a surge of something she had long since abandoned: trust. It was a strange feeling, one Jara had never allowed herself. Trust had no place in her world, not when power was everything. But now, with Cass by her side, the queen felt as though she was part of something greater than herself. Perhaps in some small way they were allies, not by chance but by choice. We can't stay here much longer, Cass whispered, breaking the silence. They'll find us if we wait. Jara nodded, her mind already turning over their options. They had no escape route, no backup. The Zorath had long since forgotten about her, and the small group of humans who had tried to help her couldn't be counted on now. This was it. It was just the two of them against an unknown force. We have to fight, Jara said, her voice steady, though a part of her still wanted to find another way. Running had never been in her nature. She was a queen, and queens did not flee. But something in her shifted in that moment. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for Cass too. This human had given her more than just survival. She had given Jara a glimpse of something that had been long lost: hope. Cass turned to her, her eyes locking with Jara's. There was a silent understanding between them now. "We'll do it together," Cass said. "We fight as one." Jara's heart pounded in her chest. She was used to leading, to making the decisions that would determine the fate of entire worlds. But this was different. This wasn't about command or conquest. This was about surviving, about standing by someone who had chosen to help her when no one else would. The sound of footsteps outside the cave echoed through the stone walls. Jara could hear the distinct rhythm of their movements, careful, calculated. They weren't rushing. They knew they were closing in on their prey. Jara's grip tightened on the weapon Cass had given her. She wasn't sure what the weapon was, but it didn't matter. In her hands, it felt like a symbol of something she had forgotten, the ability to fight back. Cass gave her a quick nod. "When they come through that entrance, we move fast. I'll cover you." Jara didn't need any more words. She was ready. She had been ready the moment Cass had saved her life. They waited in the darkness, the tension building with each passing second. Jara's mind raced, but she focused on the task ahead. She had always been the one to lead armies, to command fleets, to dictate the course of battles. But now, for the first time in her life, she was fighting as a part of something. A team. She wasn't just the queen. She was a survivor, just like Cass. The footsteps outside stopped. Jara's breath caught in her throat. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment there was nothing but the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. The enemy was close. They had to act fast. Cass's hand shot out, and in one smooth motion she pulled Jara to her feet. The plan was simple. When the enemy entered, they would strike. Jara's body was still weak, but her instincts were sharp. She knew what she had to do. Then, without warning, the cave's entrance exploded open. The enemy stormed in, their dark figures silhouetted by the bright light from the outside. There were 5 of them, all tall and imposing, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They had the look of hunters, cold, calculating, and ruthless. Cass didn't hesitate. She fired the first shot, a blast of energy that hit one of the figures square in the chest. The figure staggered back, a cloud of dust and debris surrounding it. The others didn't flinch. They were trained soldiers, used to these kinds of ambushes. They returned fire almost immediately. Jara's mind shifted into battle mode. She had fought in countless wars, led troops against enemies far more powerful than these. The difference now was that she wasn't leading a battalion of soldiers. She was standing side by side with a human, fighting for their survival. She had no time to think about the past. She had no time to think about the empire she had lost. All that mattered was the fight. The sound of energy blasts filled the air, echoing through the cave. Jara moved quickly, using the rocks for cover, her weapon steady in her hands. She fired, hitting one of the figures square in the shoulder. It staggered back, but didn't fall. Jara's heart pounded as the figure aimed its weapon at her. "Cass!" Jara shouted just as the figure fired. In an instant, Cass was there, moving with speed and precision, knocking the enemy's weapon aside. The blast missed Jara by mere inches. Cass shoved Jara behind a large rock, her own body taking the brunt of the next wave of fire. "Stay down," Cass ordered, her voice sharp. She fired again, this time hitting another enemy in the chest. The figure crumpled to the ground, its body collapsing in a heap. Jara's mind raced. They were outnumbered, but they weren't outmatched. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, the same feeling she had experienced in countless battles. This time, however, it wasn't about dominance. It was about survival. And that was something humans were incredibly good at. She peeked around the rock, her eyes scanning the remaining enemies. They were moving cautiously now, aware that they were dealing with more than just a helpless queen. Cass was standing, firing her weapon with accuracy that impressed Jara. But she couldn't keep this up for long. The enemy was regrouping. "We need to move," Jara said, her voice steady. Cass nodded. "You take the left, I'll cover the right. We can flank them." Jara's heart beat faster. She hadn't fought alongside anyone in years. She had always been the one calling the shots, the one making the plans. But now she was following someone else's lead, and it felt right. She trusted Cass. And for the first time in a long while, Jara knew what it was like to fight not for glory, but for survival. The 2 of them moved in perfect synchrony, each anticipating the other's next move. Jara fired from the left, taking out one of the figures as Cass took the right, her weapon finding its target with deadly accuracy. The remaining enemy soldiers were now on the defensive, their movements frantic. "We've got this," Cass yelled, her voice filled with determination. Jara felt a surge of something inside her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time, hope. It wasn't just about survival. It was about fighting for something greater than themselves. It was about working together. With one final blast, they took down the last of the enemies. The cave fell silent once again, but this time it was different. The danger had passed, but Jara didn't feel relief. She felt something else, pride. Not in herself, but in the bond she had formed with Cass. Together they had done what seemed impossible. They had survived. Cass turned to her, a grin on her face despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "That was too close," she said, her voice soft. Jara nodded, but her gaze never left Cass. "We did it," she said, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "Together." Cass's smile widened. "Yeah, we did." Jara looked around at the wreckage, the remains of the battle. The queen of the Zorath Empire, once the most feared ruler in the galaxy, stood in the aftermath of a fight not for power, but for survival. And in that moment, Jara realized that she was no longer just a conqueror. She was part of something more, a team, a future. And that was something worth fighting for.